Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. A lot of noise surrounding the Oregon Ducks football program as it relates to the transfer portal. As former five-star wide receiver Evan Stewart was visiting Eugene this weekend, I want to have a conversation around how Evan Stewart fits into this Oregon offense, but also just take a look at this Oregon depth chart and take a look at where they might want to add in the transfer portal. And this is a conversation that we've had over the last couple of weeks, but it continues to change as Oregon continues to get guys back, coming back for the 2024 season. This is one of those teams that you look top to bottom of this roster, of this depth chart. There are not a lot of holes in this unit, in this team in 2024, in my mind, going to be one of the most dangerous teams, not only in the Big Ten, but in the country. Really excited to get into this one. Before we do, just want to say thank you to you guys and a shout out to the Oregon fans. This has been a program that many of you guys know, extremely optimistic around with Dan Lanning at the helm. This is a team that if you want to buy stock in a program for the next 5 years, the Oregon Ducks are at the top of the list, in my opinion. The Oregon fans, you guys have shown a ton of support to the boys. Again, a program I love talking about. If you guys do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. And without further ado, let's start with Evan Stewart. Talk a little bit about this Oregon offense, and then take a look at potential needs for this Oregon team heading into 2024. Now, Evan Stewart, you look at this Oregon wide receiver room, Tez Johnson comes back. I mean, that is one of the premier elite wide receivers that you see in all of college football. Trayshawn Holden, a guy that I think absent Troy Franklin in this Oregon wide receiver room could be a dude that catches for over 1,000 yards in 2024. Many Oregon fans saw the flashes of Trayshawn Holden. Now, if it wasn't necessarily his fault. There just wasn't a ton of opportunities for him when you have Troy Franklin and Tez Johnson be as impactful as they were. I think Trayshawn Holden is a guy that maybe was really quiet or relatively quiet in 2023. I think he could be huge in 2024. And you have a guy like Gary Bryant, who I think is extremely talented. Terrence Ferguson at the tight end spot comes back. A guy like Jerrion Dickey, who I think a lot of Oregon fans have a lot of high hopes for in 2024. Now, you look at that Oregon wide receiver room, and that's not a position group with guys like Tez Johnson and Trayshawn Holden coming back that I say Oregon needs to address. I think it might be one of the better wide receiver rooms you see in the entire country and certainly in the Big Ten. Now, Evan Stewart, that's a guy that it's hard to say no. If you have the opportunity to go out and get a premier playmaker like Evan Stewart, you 100% do that every single time. And I think you're starting to realize that as Oregon in this offense have really started to explode the last 2 years, this suddenly becomes an extremely attractive destination for quarterbacks like Dillon Gabriel and Dante Moore, but also wide receivers like Evan Stewart. And so how does Evan Stewart fit into this Oregon offense? And I kind of view it as a perfect fit because you start looking at how this Oregon offense will be constructed. You have Evan Stewart and Trayshawn Holden, two guys that I think are bigger bodies that can work vertically down the field. And then you probably have the best slot receiver in all of college football in Tez Johnson. And you start viewing this Oregon wide receiver room like a basketball team, and you want wide receivers that can kind of do all sorts of different things and have different skill sets. Evan Stewart is that true wide receiver one that lines up on the boundary, can make contested catches down the field, can stretch the field vertically. And then you have a guy like Trayshawn Holden, who I think can do a lot of those same things. And then you have Tez Johnson, who I think is a guy that you need to have in an explosive offense, right? When you have two wide receivers like Evan Stewart, Trayshawn Holden, that can really put a lot of pressure on a back end of a defense in terms of safeties having to respect what they can do down the field, it opens up that middle of the field, those short intermediate route concepts for a guy like Tez Johnson to absolutely eat. And so now you're looking at this Oregon wide receiver and saying, we can attack all three levels of a defense at a very high level. And I think Tez Johnson probably is still going to be, even if you add Evan Stewart, I wouldn't be surprised if Tez Johnson is the leading receiver, I should say, for this Oregon team in 2024, because you have the conversation about Dillon Gabriel and where he excels. I mean, there's been some maybe question marks about Dillon Gabriel and what the arm talent looks like stretching the football down the field. I certainly think he can make those throws, but is that his strength of his game? It's probably not. Where did Dillon Gabriel do the most damage at the college football level? And this is not a knock on Dillon Gabriel. This is just an observation from watching a lot of Oklahoma football. he loves to work those intermediate route concepts. Drake Stoops, the Oklahoma wide receiver who kind of played in that slot, was his go-to guy. I think Tez Johnson is just a better version of Drake Stoops, a more dynamic playmaker in terms of a slot wide receiver that can catch a ball in stride and make a defense absolutely pay for it when he has the football in space, hitting those explosive plays. So you add a guy like Evan Stewart. You can't pass up on adding a guy like Evan Stewart. But more importantly, I think this opens it up for Tez Johnson even more in this Oregon offense. And you start looking at that quarterback wide receiver battery. I mean, you have one of the best quarterback rooms in all of college football, right? With Dylan Gabriel and Dante Moore. And if you add Evan Stewart, you probably have the best wide receiver room in all of the country as well. So you start looking at this offense, it's extremely dangerous. And talking about where else Oregon could add in the transfer portal on the offensive side of the football, there's not really many options that stick out, right? You look at the offensive line, you have two bookend tackles with the Johnny Cornelius coming back and Josh Conley. That's probably one of the better tackle duos that you see in the country. So at center, look like he's going to be a staple in that Oregon offensive line for the next couple of years. You grab Matthew Bedford from the transfer portal, who thinks a plug-and-play guard for Oregon. You start checking off boxes. Oregon offensive line, really, really good. Quarterback room, and Dylan Gabriel, Dante Moore. Again, I think that is probably the best quarterback room in all of college football. The wide receiver room, certainly adding Evan Stewart would be a top 5 unit in the country. And then obviously in the running back room, a guy like Jordan James, I think many Oregon fans are extremely excited about what he can do as that bell cow back. You add a guy like Noah Whittington coming back from injury. There, you look at this offense and you're saying there's not a lot of boxes that are not checked. And I'd even argue pre-Evan Stewart committing to Oregon, if he does commit to Oregon, is you're still checking that wide receiver box. Like, I am extremely excited about this Oregon wide receiver room with Evan Stewart or without Evan Stewart. And Evan Stewart would just be gravy on top, and kind of having that conversation of Oregon, what is their goals? I mean, they were one of the best teams in college football last year, right? Their only 2 losses were to a team that might win a national championship later on today. And so this Oregon team is just finding that 1% to kind of let them take that next step and go compete for a national championship, a Big Ten championship. Evan Stewart is adding that 1%. Now you look in the defensive side of the football and you start to see a lot of the same things, a lot of boxes being checked, right? And you look at the back end of this Oregon secondary, a unit that, although maybe a little young, is a unit that I think can be extremely good in 2024, right? Jaleel Florence, one of the better underclassmen cornerbacks that we saw in college football. Probably Dante Manning seems to be kind of finding his footing at the college football level. Nico Reed played some really good football for Oregon. And then you have some young guys like Roderick Pleasant, who I think is going to play a lot for Oregon in 2024. Then you look at the back end, guys like Kobe Savage coming in from the transfer portal. You start looking at that Oregon defensive back room. It's extremely talented. It's extremely deep. And you have a guy in Ife Obadegwu coming in from the 2024 class that I wouldn't be surprised if he plays relatively early on for Oregon as well. So you look at that cornerback, that secondary room, a lot of boxes being checked there. And then you go to the linebacker room, right? Jeffrey Bossa coming back, Justin Jacobs coming back. A lot of boxes being checked at that linebacker room as well. You add a guy like Braden Platt in the 2024 class. The only position, and Oregon fans have, I think, agreed with me in terms of one of the only spots where Oregon needs to probably add another body is that defensive line. Now, you're getting some massive news, right? Jordan Burch coming back, I think, can be one of the better defensive linemen we see in the Big Ten next year. You have guys like Blake Purchase and Mateo Yu, who you expect to make that jump in 2024. This defensive line is good heading into 2024. Is it elite? Does it necessarily match some of the other position groups in terms of depth and talent level? I'd probably say no. And I'd probably say that that's that one position that if you look at Oregon really trying to close that gap and become a national championship caliber team, you want those difference makers up front. And I wonder if Oregon is going to wait to add a defensive lineman. This is kind of the conversation I want to have is, I wonder if Oregon is just going to wait to add a defensive lineman in terms of after spring ball, where you're going to see another crop of players hit the portal. Because I look at the defensive linemen in the transfer portal right now, I'm not sure if a ton of them are going to come in and be significant contributors to this Oregon defensive line, because it's still a really good group. And you have a guy like Aiden Breland, you have a guy like Jericho Johnson and Elijah Rushing coming in 2024, all three of which that I think can play significant football for Oregon in 2024 as true freshmen. I wonder if Dan Lanning is going to take the approach of, all right, let's go through spring practice, see the jumps that guys like Mateo Yu and Blake Purchase make, see what we have with guys like Aiden Breland, Jericho Johnson, and Elijah Rushing. And then after that spring practice window session, you start saying, okay, do we need to add another one? Because there's a certain reality where Oregon is just fine on that defensive line. If some of these true freshmen look like they can come in and play early, and guys like Mateo Yu and Blake Purchase take that step heading into year two, that's normally where you see defensive linemen take that step. I look at this Oregon program, and I'm not trying to get ahead of myself because there's a lot of weeks, a lot of months before we play football again. This is going to be one of the best teams in the Big Ten. And again, if you're Dan Lanning and you're Oregon fans, you're just looking for that 1%. This is already a team that's going to compete for the college football playoffs. They're probably going to make the college football playoffs. They're going to compete for a Big Ten championship, especially when you look at the landscape. Ohio State, certainly not in the strongest place they've been. Michigan, as a Michigan fan, about to lose probably 15 guys to the NFL draft after this national championship game. You're Oregon saying, I think we're the power player in the Big Ten. I think we can be a team that competes for a national championship. We're just looking for that 1%. What is going to bring us over the edge? I think Evan Stewart certainly is that guy. I think a guy on the defensive line to add some depth to that unit certainly would be another position. If you're an Oregon Duck fan, like the prospects of Evan Stewart getting added to this offense is extremely exciting. But you look at this team top to bottom, take a kind of a check mark, a checklist to this team. There's not a lot of boxes that are left unchecked for this Oregon team, a unit, a team, a program I'm extremely excited for in 2024. Appreciate you guys rocking with the boys. Would love to hear from you guys in terms of Evan Stewart. You want to see him in this offense? I'm sure a lot of answers to that would be yes, but more importantly, where else should Oregon be looking for in this transfer portal? Appreciate you guys rocking with the boys again. If you guys do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later.